Chapter 28 Biogeochemical Cycling and Ecosystem Productivity, Section 28.2 Nutrient Cycling. So what is nutrient cycling? So we can describe nutrient cycling as the patterns of cycling nutrients in the biosphere that involves not only metabolism by living organisms, but also a series of strictly abiotic chemical reactions. In essence, the movement of nutrients between the organic matter in the biosphere, both living and dead, and back to their inorganic store in sediments and soils. All biogeochemical cycles for all ecologically significant elements have both an organic and an inorganic phase. For example, carbon dioxide. We know that carbon dioxide is taken up by plants. It's combined with water and energy from the sun to produce carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates are then fed to consumer-type organisms, herbivores and carnivores. Metabolism in both plants and consumers, respiratory processes, cell respiration, returns this CO2 back to the atmosphere store. The carbon dioxide that is stored in plants and animals can also be decomposed when these organisms die by detritus feeders and other decomposers. So understanding the cycle of a single element requires a lot of knowledge. It requires knowledge about the biology of organisms and their metabolic activity and how they take up nutrients and how they use nutrients. It also involves the geologic availability of the nutrient and the chemistry involved with this nutrient in organic and inorganic processes. The major reserves for all metabolically important elements are either found in the atmosphere, the lithosphere, or the hydrosphere, or a combination of those three. So let's take a look at how nutrients enter ecosystems, how are they supplied to ecosystems. So one way is the weathering of rock. Rock is composed of various elements. You break down the rock to individual atoms and molecules, and you release these nutrients into the environment. Some important nutrients released by weathering include calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, silicon, iron, aluminum, and phosphorus, and all the micronutrients. So we've just discussed the circle in the bottom left-hand corner. Let's now look at atmospheric input of nutrients. So there are a number of nutrients that come from an atmospheric store. This includes carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, chloride, calcium, and sodium. So these nutrients are added or are found in the atmosphere. They can enter the biosphere either by some sort of process that absorbs them, or they can, like photosynthesis, or they can be produced by lightning and come out of the atmosphere by precipitation. So precipitation is important for nitrogen, sulfur, chloride, calcium, and sodium. Carbon, of course, is taken in to the biosphere by plants that can absorb the carbon dioxide into their leaves and then convert that carbon into simple glucose molecules in their chloroplasts. Humans have altered the atmospheric input We've increased the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we've increased the concentration of nitrogen from fossil fuel burning and the burning of biomass. So here we can see a diagram of how nitrogen is added to an ecosystem. It can be natural by processes like lightning fixation and even biomass burning, because a lot of biomass burning are natural fires. But nitrogen can also be added by industrial processes, transportation, and pollution. And of course, we produce a lot of artificial nitrogen just to grow plants. So that is entering into ecosystems too. Some of the pathways for some nutrients from the atmosphere to the biosphere are very, very complex. And that's all I want to do is point out to you in this diagram of the sulfur cycle. You don't have to know it. I just want to show to you that some nutrient cycling is a very complex thing. Nutrients can also be added to ecosystems through biological input. So here we're ignoring photosynthesis, but we're mainly talking about things like nitrogen fixation. So there's a number of organisms, bacteria, actinomycetes, and blue-green algae that have the ability to absorb nitrogen from the atmosphere and create solid forms of nitrogen that can be used for metabolic processes, and often they form symbiotic relationships with other organisms and trade nitrogen for things like glucose. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you the root of a legume, and those nodules contain bacteria, and that bacteria lives in a symbiotic way with the legume, exchanging nitrogen for things like glucose. So sometimes nutrients can enter an ecosystem just by the addition related to inorganic or organic matter just moving into an ecosystem. So the addition of animals can be a significant increase of nutrients, and sometimes it's just their waste products that are added to the ecosystem, but there's nutrients in that. So for example, a herd of elephants on the African savanna, as it moves, these organisms defecate and produce urea, and of course that adds nutrients to the ecosystem, and they may have consumed the organic matter that produced those wastes in some other location. So these nutrients can also be released when the organism dies or sheds its tissues. And sometimes what we're talking about is not just organic matter entering ecosystems, but inorganic. So, let's say salt spray throws salt onto the terrestrial surface, and salt is added to the ecosystem and can be used for metabolism. So how are nutrients lost to ecosystems? So we'll look at two major types of loss. The most common are gaseous losses, and that may involve something like a fire, right? So trees, forests burn, that releases nutrients in a gaseous form into the atmosphere. But gaseous losses can also occur because of organisms, and this is particularly true of nitrogen. So there's bacteria in soils. If the soils become very wet or anaerobic, the bacteria that live in these environments can take organic matter and reduce the organic matter into a gas, and this is particularly true of soil nitrogen. So as I said, here is one major way that the nutrients are lost via gaseous losses: forest fire. So while there is some ash that is deposited at the bottom or at the soil surface, a lot of the nutrients are vaporized and end up moving up in the plume into the atmosphere and will fall out at some other location or be absorbed by some other process organisms. Okay, let's look at the second general way that nutrients are lost to ecosystems. So this loss can either occur when the nutrients are in inorganic or organic form, organic matter. One way is by soil erosion, by wind or water, moving nutrients in organic state or organic matter from one ecosystem to another. Erosion is very active in agriculture and forest systems, where cultivation and grazing and clear cutting leave the soil unprotected to the effects of wind and water. Another important process of nutrient loss is leaching. So leaching is a process where water flows vertically through the soil and transports nutrients found in the soil downward in the soil profile. And those nutrients may end up in the groundwater and then later on in streams and lakes or ocean bodies. Leaching losses are generally low in most ecosystems unless they're disturbed. A disturbed ecosystem, an ecosystem that's burned or cut over and plant mass is allowed to decompose, these will have high leaching losses. So human activity tends to increase leaching losses in many ecosystems. And of course, nutrients can be lost by the loss of organisms. For example, the emigration of animals, the removal of forest. When we remove forest, we're taking nutrients out of that ecosystem, and humans play a pretty important role in nutrient loss. One important study related to nutrient loss was the Hubbard-Brook study, and this is where scientists clear-cut a watershed where there was that had a forest growing on it, and then followed the loss of nutrients from that watershed, in particular nitrate, as shown in the bottom graph. So watershed 2 is one that was cut over. You can see an immediate flush of nitrate loss. And then watershed 2 is one, or watershed 6 is one that's just stable. And you can see that there isn't any sudden increase or decrease in nutrient loss. It's just constant over time, very low. Now, a lot of nutrient cycling occurs internally within ecosystems. And the process is basically soil supplies the nutrients for the growing biomass, the plant mass that is on its surface. And then those nutrients are redistributed from the plants to herbivores and to carnivores. The nutrients return back to the soil where their organic form is decomposed and they produce inorganic nutrients, which are taken up again by plants and repeating the whole cycle again. So we know some of the main inputs of nutrients besides the internal cycle are things like weathering, rainfall, atmospheric sources in animals and organisms. But we also add a lot of nutrients artificially fertilizing ecosystems to get higher productivity from things like crops or even forest trees. As I said, the main source of nutrients in terms of internal nutrient cycling is the death of organisms. When they die, their bodies decompose, and that organic matter is broken down until inorganic nutrients are released back into the soil where they can be taken up again by plants. Under natural conditions, inputs from plants are the most important in terms of how much nutrients are returned back to the soil. There's a lot of stored nutrients in plant cover, whether it's forest or grassland or whatever it may be. A lot less nutrients stored in the animal community. Within soil, nutrients are stored in the soil particles, either as dead organic matter or chemical compounds that are locked up on soil particles. But as I said, organic matter decomposition is the main process that recycles nutrients back into the soil. So there's a whole set of organisms that are involved in decomposition. It usually begins with large organisms like earthworms, arthropods, ants, beetles, and termites, and gastropods, slugs, and snails. And then as the particles become smaller and smaller, as they pass through the digestive system of these organisms, they're then decomposed by organisms that require the organic matter in smaller pieces, things like bacteria, fungi, then break down these smaller pieces and produce inorganic nutrients. The decomposition of organic matter can take anywhere from several months to several years to complete. It's of course quickest where you have the highest temperatures and plenty of moisture, and of course low in areas that are cold or dry. So the deserts and polar regions have very slow decomposition rates, while the tropical rainforest is quite high. So here's an organism, a fungi that plays a very important role in the forest floor. This is its fruiting body, plays a very important role in converting organic matter back into inorganic nutrients.